little tune.
I set the box on the tailgate and smiled. Diane stood in the driveway with her hands on her hips and said, "Better men are lining up for me. You'll die alone in this house." I picked up the next box, carried it to her Camry, set it down easy. She stared at me like my calm was an insult. Maybe it was. "You're not even going to say anything?" she said. "Have a safe drive, Diane." She got in the car. I watched her back out onto Cason Lane and disappear around the curve. I stood there in the driveway in the August heat until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. Then I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor in the dark with my yellow lab biscuit and his big dumb head on my knee, and I thought about what she'd said. Better men are lining up for me. Maybe so, but I'd been reading the router logs for 3 weeks. I knew things she didn't know I knew. The smile in that driveway wasn't bravado. It was a man who had already read the verdict and was just waiting for the sentencing to catch up. I pulled the folded printout from my jacket pocket and set it on the kitchen table. 14 months. Right there in black and white. I didn't turn the lights on. The day had started like any other Tuesday. I was at my desk at Colton Communications, second floor above a title company on Broad Street. The window AC unit working too hard and losing. I had a router log printout in front of me, folded once, still warm from the printer. I was looking at it when Gary walked in. Gary Colton, my stepbrother, senior account manager. 4 years at the firm, hired by me, paid well by me, trusted completely by me up until 3 weeks ago when a billing anomaly on the firm's account sent me to the router logs, and I found something that had nothing to do with billing. "You coming to the staff lunch?" Gary asked. "Diane's meeting us over there." "No," I said. "I'm good." "You sure? It's that Thai place on—" "I'm sure, Gary." He looked at me for half a second. Then he nodded and left. I watched him walk down the hall. He had no idea. He'd been walking through my office for 14 months with no idea. I folded the printout back up and put it in my jacket pocket and went back to work. That evening at the house on Cason Lane, Diane made her move. She'd been building to it for a week. Little things. Cooler in the mornings. Spending more time on her phone with the screen angled away. I'd noticed all of it and said nothing, because by that point, I was already 2 moves ahead and I needed her to think she was driving. She waited until I was on my second cup of coffee. "I've been thinking," she said. "It would make sense to transfer the firm's secondary operating account into a joint account, just to simplify things." I set the mug down. "No," I said. "I don't think I will." "Ray, it's just paperwork." I said, "No, Diane." The calm in my voice stopped her mid-sentence. She stared at me. I picked up my mug and went back to my coffee. She didn't push it. She just stood there for a moment, and then she walked out of the kitchen, and I heard her upstairs on her phone 10 minutes later, talking quietly. I sat there and thought, she's calling Gary, or she's calling Kathy. Either way, the move she just tried to make tells me everything about where she thinks she is in this. She thought she was winning. 3 days later, she was loading boxes into her Camry. She'd announced she was staying at her sister Kathy's for a while. She said it like it was her idea, like she was the one making the choice. I helped her carry boxes without a word. She kept waiting for me to react, to beg, to get loud. I didn't do any of those things, and it drove her crazy. "You're not even upset," she said. "I'm fine." "That's pathetic, Ray. You know that?" I carried another box to the car. "You built this little firm and you think it's something," she said. "It's 8 people in a rented office above a title company. That's not a legacy. That's a hobby." I set the box down. "Your clients are going to follow whoever's actually interesting," she said. "And that's not you. It's never been you." I picked up the last box. "Better men are lining up for me," she said. "You'll die alone in this house." I smiled. I loaded the box. She stood there waiting for the wound to show on my face, and it didn't come. And finally, she got in the car and left. I called my mother from the F-250, parked in the driveway. "How are you?" Nora asked. "Fine." "Ray Colton, fine is what you say when you're not fine." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you eating?" "I'm eating." "Are you sleeping?" "Some." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come down there?" "No, I'll explain later. I promise." "All right," she said. But Ray, I know, Mom. She was never afraid of enough things. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, I'll call you this weekend. I went inside and Biscuit met me at the side door. He put his nose against my hand and looked up at me with those dopey lab eyes, and I sat down on the kitchen floor with him and didn't turn the lights on for a while. I wasn't angry. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of situation. You think you'll be angry. You think you'll be loud and shaking and breaking things. But when you've had 3 weeks to sit with the evidence, the anger burns off. What's left underneath is quieter, more useful. I pulled the router log printout from my jacket and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it in the dark. 14 months. Right there in black and white, pulled from the firm's own network. Gary had been using the office Wi-Fi. Not always, but enough. Enough to flag a billing anomaly, enough for me to pull the logs, enough for me to find the email thread that started in June of last year and hadn't stopped. He'd been in my office, eating my lunch, sleeping in my house when I traveled, smiling at me every single day. I folded the paper back up and put it in my pocket. Angry is what you feel when you're surprised. I wasn't surprised anymore. I sat there in the kitchen with Biscuit's head on my knee and that printout on the table, and I thought about Gary walking into my office that morning, asking if I was coming to lunch. 14 months. He'd been in my office, eating my lunch, sleeping in my house, and he'd smiled at me every single day. I folded the paper back up and put it in my pocket. I wasn't angry anymore. Angry is what you feel when you're surprised. I drove to Walt Pruitt's house on a Saturday morning, first week of September. Walt lived on Barfield Road in a 1970s ranch, with overgrown boxwoods out front, and a study lined with advertising industry awards that nobody dusted anymore. He'd run Pruitt and Associates out of Nashville for 32 years before he retired. He'd been my silent partner since I started Colton Communications 11 years ago. And the reason I say silent is that Diane had no idea he existed. Walt already had coffee made when I got there. He didn't ask why I'd come. We sat on the back porch for 20 minutes, listening to the birds and the sound of a lawnmower 2 houses over. And then Walt spoke first. How long have you known? 3 weeks. How long has it been going on? 14 months? He nodded. He went inside without a word. He came back with a manila folder and set it on the porch table between our coffee cups. I opened it. The first document was the silent partnership agreement for Colton Communications. I knew it existed. I'd signed it 11 years ago, but I hadn't looked at it in years, and seeing it there on Walt's back porch with the September sun coming through the trees, I understood why he'd brought it out. The second document was a deed, a 3-acre lot on Percy Priest Lake, held in a Nashville LLC that Walt's attorney had set up 4 years ago. Diane's name had never been on it. She'd never known it existed. I sat there for a moment. I didn't want to be right, Walt said, but I wanted you to be ready. How long have you been watching this? Long enough. I read the documents at Walt's kitchen table while he refilled the coffee. The partnership structure was clean and legally sound. Walt's attorney in Nashville had handled everything. The lake property was separate from any marital asset, documented and clear. Why didn't you tell me about the lake property? I asked. Walt sat back down across from me. Because you didn't need it until now. I drove back to Murfreesboro thinking about that. 4 years. He'd been holding those documents for 4 years. He'd seen something I hadn't, or maybe he'd seen the same thing I had and just refused to look away from it. The thing about Walt is that he doesn't say much. But when he does say something, it's because he's been carrying it for a while and he decided you were ready to hear it. I've known him for 15 years, and he's never once been wrong about timing. Back at the office Monday, Gary was running a client meeting in the conference room. I stood in the hallway and watched through the glass. He was good at it, I'll give him that. He leaned forward when he talked, made eye contact, laughed at the right moments. Clients liked him immediately. That's why I hired him. I stood there and watched for 60 seconds, and I thought about whether building a case against my own stepbrother made me the same kind of man who uses people. I sat with that for a full minute. Then, I went back to my desk and opened the router log file, and the doubt resolved itself. Gary chose this. Every day for 14 months, he chose it. I'm just paying attention. On a Tuesday afternoon, I drove over to Siegel High School to meet with Doug Hensley, the counselor. His office smelled like old carpet and dry erase markers. Doug was careful, the kind of man who measures every sentence before he lets it out. But he'd called me the week before and said he needed to talk about Claire. Claire was 17, a junior, and she'd been quieter than usual since April. I'd noticed it. I'd chalked it up to normal teenage withdrawal. I was wrong about that. Doug slid a folder across his desk. I can't tell you what to do with this, he said, but I can tell you it didn't come from nowhere. I opened the folder. 8 months of documented behavioral notes. Declining grades in 2 classes. Withdrawal from her friend group. One incident in May where she left school early without signing out. A note from her English teacher about a journal entry that Doug had flagged. I know where it came from, I said. I figured you did. I took the folder. That night, I filed it in the same locked drawer as the router logs and the partnership documents. The drawer was getting heavy. Claire found me in the kitchen on a Wednesday night. She'd been over at Kathy's visiting Diane, and she came home with her jaw set and her eyes hard, in a way that reminded me of her grandmother. "Why aren't you doing anything?" she said. "She's over there, acting like she won something. She thinks she did. Dad. Claire. I'm doing something, I'm just not doing it loud." She stared at me for a long moment. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." She picked up a dish towel off the counter and threw it down hard. Then she walked out of the kitchen, but she didn't leave the house. I heard her upstairs, and after a while, I heard her TV on, and I stood in the kitchen and thought, she's angrier than I am. That's fair. She didn't have 3 weeks to get quiet about it. I changed my timeline that night, from cautious to deliberate. There's a difference. I met with Frank Dillard, my attorney, in Nashville the following week. Frank had an office on 2nd Avenue, no nonsense. The kind of lawyer who lets you talk first and then asks 2 questions that cut straight to the bone. "You want this clean," he said. "I want it right." Tennessee's an equitable distribution state. The partnership interest and the lake property are both premarital or separately structured. You're in decent shape. How decent? Better than most. He asked no unnecessary questions. I liked that about Frank. I drove home from Nashville in the F-250, windows down, September still warm, but with something cooler underneath it if you paid attention. I called Nora. "Are you eating?" she asked. "Mom, I just came from a meeting." "That's not an answer." "Yes, I'm eating." I told her about the lake property, about Walt holding the deed for 4 years. She was quiet for a moment. "Walt always did like you better than he let on," she said. I laughed. Out loud, alone in the truck cab, a real laugh that surprised me. It came from somewhere I hadn't visited in a while. I wasn't expecting it to be funny. It was. "Yeah," I said, "turns out." I pulled off at a gas station outside Smyrna and sat there with the engine running. The lake property deed was in the glove box. Diane had been in my car 100 times, never once opened that glove box. I thought about that for a second. How much you can hide in plain sight when someone's only paying attention to themselves. Then I pulled back onto 41 and drove home to my dog and my empty house and my locked drawer full of evidence. And I felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Mid-September, industry lunch at the Nashville Convention Center. One of those events where everybody's wearing a lanyard and pretending they didn't just come for the free lunch. I was there representing Colton Communications, sitting at a round table with people I half knew from the regional media circuit. The woman next to me was Joanna Ferris, Regional Communications Director for the Tennessee Association of Broadcasters. 6 years in the role, direct handshake, no lanyard because she'd already taken it off and stuffed it in her bag. We started talking about a client we both had peripheral connections to. She knew her stuff. She didn't oversell herself, which in that room was unusual enough to be noticeable. "Your firm has a good reputation," she said. "You don't oversell." I try not to. Most people in this room can't say that. We talked for a while. She mentioned an ex-husband offhand, no drama attached to it, the way people do when they've processed something and moved past needing to perform the pain. I didn't push on it. She didn't ask about my situation. We just talked about work, about the regional media landscape, about a conference in Chattanooga in November. that neither of us particularly wanted to attend. When the lunch broke up, we exchanged cards. I drove back to Murfreesboro thinking about the fact that she'd looked at me like I was a person, not a role, not someone's husband or someone's boss, just a person. It had been a while since that happened, and I noticed it the way you notice the temperature dropping. Not dramatic, just real. The following week, I attended a client's anniversary party at the Embassy Suites in Murfreesboro. The Harwells, a family I'd represented for 6 years, celebrating 40 years in business. Good people. Nice event. I was talking to Ed Harwell and his wife Patty near the entrance when I saw Diane come through the door with Gary. Gary froze when he saw me, just for a second, but I saw it. Diane recovered faster. She took Gary's arm and walked in like she owned the room. I'll give her that. She was good at that move. She'd practiced it. I didn't stop talking to Ed and Patty. I didn't look over. I kept my eyes on Ed and let him finish his story about the first storefront they'd rented in 1984. And I laughed in the right place, and I did not look at the door. Gary avoided me for most of the night. Diane circulated, working the room, smiling at people, performing the version of herself she'd been polishing for years. I watched her out of the corner of my eye and thought, she thinks this is the part where she wins publicly. At the bar, Gary finally came over. He had a bourbon in his hand and his jaw was tight. Ray, I didn't know you'd be... Gary, enjoy the party. That's all I said. I turned back to my conversation. He stood there for a second. Then he walked away. Diane watched from across the room. I could feel her watching. She couldn't read my face, and I knew that was worse for her than anger would have been. Anger is a reaction. Calm is a plan. I drove out to the Percy Priest Lake property on a Saturday in early October. The maples were turning. Cold water smell off the lake. That particular October smell. That Tennessee does better than anywhere else I've been. I walked the dock. 3 acres, good soil. The lot sitting quiet and unhurried. I called Walt from the dock. I'm out here, I said. Good. What do you think? I think you knew something I didn't. I knew you'd need a place to land. I looked out at the water for a while. I'm thinking about what you build when you build for yourself, instead of for someone else's idea of what you should be. That's the only kind of building worth doing, Walt said. I drove back to the office that afternoon and spent 3 hours pulling documentation on Sandra Pell. Sandra was the HR coordinator at the Rutherford County School District, Diane's work ally, and she'd been filing false conference reports to cover for Diane on 2 occasions in April and June. I had 2 sources, a former HR coordinator who'd left the district in June and had no reason to protect anyone anymore, and a scheduling discrepancy in the district's public calendar that didn't match Sandra's filed reports. I didn't confront Sandra. I built the file. That same week, I found the Kathy Morse connection. Kathy had been added as a calendar manager on Diane's district account, an administrative convenience that nobody had thought through. The shared calendar sync had captured a text chain. Kathy had cleared 2 weekends in April and June and texted Gary the house code. I printed the chain, added it to the drawer. The drawer was getting full. On a Thursday afternoon, Gary closed my office door. I need to know what's happening, he said. With what? Don't do that. Diane says you went to see an attorney. I own a business, Gary. I see attorneys. Ray, you should get back to your accounts. He grabbed the edge of my desk. His knuckles were white. I'm trying to talk to you. I know, I said. I'm choosing not to. He slammed the door on the way out, hard enough that the glass rattled. I watched through it as he walked down the hall to his office and sat down hard in his chair. He put his hands on his desk and stared at them. I turned back to my monitor. The thing about Gary is that he needed me to be angry. Angry would mean he was worth the reaction. Quiet meant something else entirely. And he knew it. And he didn't know what to do with it. I went to Walt's that evening. I told him about the event idea. A firm-wide client appreciation night at the Lakeview Club. Every professional contact Ray and Diane shared in Murfreesboro. 40 guests, nice room, good bourbon, and me, standing up in front of all of them. Walt listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his coffee. You're going to stand up in front of every person whose opinion she values, he said. Yes. And you're going to forgive her. In front of all of them. Walt set the mug down. He looked at me for a long moment. That's the cruelest thing you could do to her. I know. Good. I drove back from Walt's in the dark. The lake property deed still in the glove box. The email archive on a thumb drive in my jacket pocket next to the rotor log. 2 pieces of paper and a drive the size of my thumbnail. That's all it took to map 14 months of a life I didn't know I was living. I turned onto Broad Street and looked up at the second floor of my own building and thought, she thought she was taking something from me. She had no idea what she was walking away from. I booked the Lakeview Club through Pete Dunbar. Pete managed private events at the club in addition to running the bar on Friday nights. He was 58, seen everything twice, talked to almost nobody. He looked at the guest list without a word, handed it back to me and said, open bar or limited? Open, I said. No, Maker's on the well. Good choice. He asked no questions about why the guest list included both Ray and Diane Colton, when everyone in Murfreesboro knew they were separated. That was one of the things I liked about Pete. I met Joanna Ferris for coffee in Nashville on a Tuesday, ostensibly to discuss a shared client referral. The coffee shop was on Charlotte Avenue, a quiet place, good espresso. We talked about the referral for about 10 minutes, and then it became something else. You seem like a man who's running a play, she said. I'm running several. Anything I should know about? Not yet. She looked at me for a second. I respect that answer. She mentioned she'd found my firm's profile through singletune.com, a professional networking platform she used for regional media contacts. She'd been following Colton Communications work for 2 years before we met at the Nashville lunch. I pulled it up on my phone. The firm's page was clean, professional, well-reviewed. I hadn't updated it in months. It had been building reputation on its own while I was dealing with everything else. I sat there for a second thinking about that. Things that grow while you're not watching. You have a good presence on there, Joanna said. It's straightforward, no fluff. That's the goal. Most small firms oversell themselves on those platforms. Yours just shows the work. I looked at the page and thought about the last 14 months and what the firm had done during all of it. Grown by 2 clients. Won a regional award I'd barely noticed. Added a service line that Gary had actually proposed, which was an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge, but true. The firm was good. Whatever else was falling apart, the firm was good. I'd like to refer you to a contact in Knoxville, Joanna said, if you're interested. It's a broadcaster who needs a PR firm that doesn't talk too much. I'm interested. She wrote the name on a card and slid it across the table. We talked for another hour. I drove back to Murfreesboro, thinking about the fact that something was growing in the middle of everything that was dying, and that was either deeply ironic or exactly how it was supposed to work. I called Diane from the F-250 in the parking lot of my office. I'm doing a client appreciation event at the Lakeview Club, I said. 3rd Friday of October, I'd like you to come. She was quiet for a moment. You want me there? I think it's the right thing, for both of us. We have shared professional relationships in this community. It would be good for people to see us handle this with dignity. Another pause. Longer. All right, she said. I'll have Pete put you on the list. I hung up and sat in the parking lot. She'd said yes because she thought she was already winning and she wanted the audience to see it. She wanted to walk into that room on the arm of the man she'd chosen and let everyone see that she was fine, that she was better than fine, that Ray Colton's wife had moved on and was thriving. That was exactly what I needed her to think. Kathy called me 2 days later. Ray, what is this really about? It's a client event, Kathy? She says you've been too calm. Tell her I appreciate the concern. I'm serious, she's worried. She should come to the event and see for herself that everything's fine. Kathy was quiet for a moment. I could hear her thinking. Ray, Kathy, I've got a call coming in. I'll talk to you later. I hung up. Kathy was smart enough to know something was off and not smart enough to figure out what it was. That was fine. I needed her talking to Diane, not thinking clearly. Claire came by the office on a Thursday after school. She sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since the kitchen conversation, like she was trying to read a map she'd never seen before. Are you okay? She asked. Yeah, I'm good. You seem like you're waiting for something. I am. The event? I looked at her. How'd you know about the event? Mom called me. She wanted to know if I was going. Claire paused. I told her I didn't know. You don't have to go. Do you want me there? I thought about that. I want you wherever you're comfortable. If you want to come, you're welcome. If you don't, I understand. She picked at the arm of the chair. She's
Absolute home run. She's incredible. Stop wasting your time on the generic stuff and join singletune.com.
been telling people you're having some kind of breakdown, that the firm is struggling. I know. Is it? The firm is fine. She's saying it because she wants people to feel sorry for her, for leaving. I know that too. Claire looked at me for a long moment. You're not going to tell me what you're doing, are you? Not yet. She stood up. She picked up her backpack. At the door, she stopped. I'm going to the event, she said. Okay. And I'm sitting with you. She left. I sat there for a minute with the quiet of the office around me. My daughter was 17 years old and sharper than most adults I knew, and she was angry on my behalf in a way I couldn't quite be angry for myself anymore. I thought about that. About what she'd been carrying since April, watching this happen and not being able to say anything to either of us. I picked up the phone and called Doug Hensley. The event is the third Friday, I said. I wanted you to know in case Claire needs to talk to someone after. I appreciate that, Doug said. Con, how is she? Angry, but present. She's choosing to be present. That's a good sign. Yeah, I said, it is. I met Doug for a beer at Rudy's Bar on Church Street that Friday evening. Sticky vinyl booths, Merle Haggard on the jukebox, Maker's Mark on the well shelf. The kind of bar that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. I liked it for that reason. Doug slid into the booth across from me and ordered a beer and said, I've been thinking about the folder. The school notes. Yes. I want you to know, if this goes anywhere official, I'm prepared to stand behind that documentation. I appreciate that. Claire's a good kid. She deserved better than what she got this year. I took a drink of my Maker's. Yeah, she did. We sat for a while. The jukebox cycled through Merle, and then into something newer that neither of us recognized. Outside on Church Street, a group of people walked past the window laughing about something. You know what I keep thinking about? Doug said. What? Gary walked into your office every day. For 14 months. I know. And he just... Doug shook his head. I mean, I've seen a lot of messy situations in my job. But that's a particular kind of cold. He needed something I had, I said. That's the whole story. He needed the firm, needed the income, needed the status that came with being associated with something successful. And he needed Diane to tell him he deserved it. They were good for each other that way. That's a generous interpretation. It's not generous. It's just accurate. Doug looked at me. You're not angry. I was. I burned through it. What's on the other side of it? I thought about that. Clarity, I said, mostly. I drove home from Rudy's at 10 o'clock. Biscuit met me at the door. I fed him and sat on the back porch in the October dark, the air finally starting to have some weight to it, that first real cool of fall coming in off the fields to the south. I had the thumb drive in my jacket pocket, the router logs in the locked drawer, the partnership documents, the lake property deed, the Sandra Pell file, the Kathy Morse text chain, the school counselor's notes. I had a room full of people who thought they were coming to a client appreciation event, and I had 2 weeks. I went inside and let Biscuit in and went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, I slept straight through until morning. The week before the event, Gary started to get nervous. I could see it in the office. He was quieter than usual, which for Gary was unusual. He watched me more. He'd come to my doorway and then think better of it and walk past. He was trying to read me and coming up empty, and it was making him twitchy. On Wednesday, he knocked on my door frame. Can I ask you something? Sure. The Lakeview event? Am I expected to be there? I looked up from my monitor. It's a staff event as much as a client event. It would look odd if you weren't. He nodded slowly. Okay, Gary. He looked at me. Wear something nice. He left. I watched him walk back to his office. He sat down at his desk and stared at his screen and didn't type anything for a full minute. I turned back to my work. I drove out to the lake property again that Thursday, just to think. I walked the dock in the late afternoon, the sun going low over the water. The maples fully turned now, orange and red against the gray sky. Cold water smell. Quiet. I called Joanna. Are you still in Murfreesboro next Friday? I asked. I could be, she said. And why? I'm doing a client event at the Lakeview Club. It's business, but it's also, I'd like to have someone there who's on my side. She was quiet for a second. That's a straightforward thing to ask, she said. I'm trying to be straightforward. All right, I'll be there. Thank you. Ray. Yeah. Whatever you're doing, be careful with it. I will. I stood on the dock for a while after I hung up. The water was still. A heron came in low over the far end of the lake and landed without a sound. I watched it for a minute. Then I drove back to town. The night before the event, I sat at my kitchen table with the locked drawer open in front of me. I went through everything one more time. Router logs, partnership documents, lake property deed, Sandra Pell file, Kathy Morse text chain, Doug Hensley's folder on Claire, Frank Dillard's notes from our Nashville meeting. I put everything back, locked the drawer, I fed Biscuit, had a glass of Makers, watched the news without listening to it. Went to bed at 10, I slept fine. The third Friday of October. I got to the Lakeview Club at 5:30 to walk the room with Pete. Dark wood paneling, bourbon smell baked into the walls, the lake visible through the big windows on the south side, the water black in the early evening. Pete had set up the bar at the far end. Makers on the well. Good. 42 confirmed, Pete said. Good. Caterers here. Food's set up in the back. Good. He looked at me. You need anything else before people start arriving? No, I'm good, Pete. He nodded and went back to the bar. I stood in the middle of the room for a minute. Long tables along the walls with the firm's work displayed. Campaign materials, client results, awards. Nothing flashy, just the work. I'd had Claire help me put it together. She'd come in on Tuesday afternoon and we'd spent 3 hours laying it out. She had a good eye, better than mine. This looks like something, she said when we stepped back and looked at it. That's the idea. She looked at me. Are you nervous? No. Liar, I laughed. A little. She bumped my shoulder. Don't be. The work is good. Let the work do it. She was right about that. Guests started arriving at 6. Clients, colleagues, people I'd worked with for years. The room filled up. I worked the floor, shaking hands, having real conversations. The kind of conversations that happen when you've built actual relationships over time instead of just managed them. Joanna arrived at 6:15. She found me near the windows and shook my hand. Nice room, she said. Thanks for coming. The work display is smart, she said. Let's the room do the talking. My daughter's idea. She looked over at Claire, who was talking to 2 of my clients near the bar. She's got good instincts. She does. Diane arrived at 6:40 with Gary. I saw them come in from across the room. Diane had dressed carefully, the kind of careful that takes 2 hours to look effortless. Gary was in a dark suit. They stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the room. Diane found me. Our eyes met. She smiled, a composed, social smile, and steered Gary toward the bar. I watched them for 2 seconds. Then I turned back to the conversation I was having with Ed Harwell and his wife Patty. Great turnout, Ed said. It is. I'm glad people came. Wouldn't have missed it. 11 years, Ray. You've done good work for us. You've been good clients. That makes it easier. Patty Harwell put her hand on my arm. How are you doing, really? I'm doing well, Patty. Genuinely. She looked at me carefully. You seem it, she said. You seem settled. I am. I worked the room for another hour. I talked to everyone. I talked to Diane's colleagues from the school district. I talked to people who'd heard the rumors and come to see what state I was in. I talked to Pete at the bar when things slowed for a minute. She's watching you, Pete said quietly, setting down my Makers. I know. She's been watching you for an hour. Good. He looked at me with that expression of his, the one that said he'd seen this before and knew how it ended. You want another one of these? Not yet. I've got to talk in a few minutes. At 8 o'clock, I tapped a glass. The room went quiet. 42 people, the full weight of every professional relationship I had in Murfreesboro, and most of the ones I had in Nashville. Diane stood near the back with Gary. She had her social face on, but her eyes were careful. I stood at the front of the room with my makers in my hand. I want to thank everyone for coming, I said. 11 years ago, I started Colton Communications in a rented office above a title company on Broad Street. The carpet was bad and the AC was worse, and I had 4 clients and 1 employee. Tonight, I've got 8 employees and a client list I'm genuinely proud of. That doesn't happen without the people in this room. So, thank you. A round of applause. I let it settle. I also want to be honest about something, I said, because some of you have heard things, and I'd rather you hear it from me. My wife and I are separating. It's not a secret, and I'm not going to pretend it is. These things happen. They're painful. But they don't have to be ugly, and I don't intend for this one to be. I looked across the room. Found Diane. She was very still. Diane has been part of this community for a long time, I said. She's good at her job, and she cares about this city. Whatever happens between us personally, I respect what she's built professionally, and I wish her well. I raised my glass. To the work, I said, and to the people who make it worth doing. The room raised glasses. I drank. I looked at Diane over the rim of my glass. Her face was a complicated thing right then. I just stood up in front of every person whose opinion she valued and forgiven her publicly, graciously, with no anger and no accusation. I'd made her the dignified ex-wife instead of the woman who'd been sleeping with her husband's stepbrother in her own house. And she couldn't say a word about it, because to object would be to explain why she objected. Walt had been right. It was the cruelest thing I could do to her. I watched her process it. I watched the smile stay on her face while something behind her eyes went very quiet and very cold. Gary put his hand on her arm. She didn't look at him. Claire appeared at my elbow. That was good, she said quietly. Yeah? The forgiveness thing, that was... She shook her head. That was really something. I meant it, I said. She looked at me. I know. That's what made it work. The room went back to conversation. I worked the floor for another hour. Joanna found me near the windows again at 9 o'clock. That speech, she said, and too much? No, it was exactly right. She looked across the room toward Diane. She doesn't know what to do with it. That's the idea. She thought she was coming here to be seen winning. Yes. And instead, she's being forgiven in public. Which is worse, I said. Joanna looked at me. Yes, she said, which is worse. People started leaving at 9:30. I shook hands, said goodbyes, thanked people for coming. Diane and Gary left at 9:40 without speaking to me. Gary nodded at me from across the room on his way out. I nodded back. That was the last civil thing that passed between us. Claire hugged me at the door. I'm proud of you, she said. Don't make me sentimental in front of Pete. She laughed. Too late. She left. I went back to the bar and sat down, and Pete poured me another Maker's without being asked. Nice evening, he said. It was. She looked like she swallowed something wrong. She did. He leaned on the bar. You're not done, though. No, I said. I'm not. He nodded. Went to the other end of the bar. I sat there and drank my Maker's, and looked out the windows at the black water of the lake, and thought about what came next. The week after the event, things moved fast. I served Gary his termination notice on a Monday morning. I had Frank Dillard walk me through the language the week before. Gary was an at-will employee, no partnership stake, no equity, nothing that complicated the separation. His employment contract had a non-solicitation clause that covered existing clients for 18 months. I called him into my office at 9 o'clock. I had the termination letter on the desk. He looked at it, then at me. You're firing me. Yes. For what cause? Cause is documented in the letter. Unauthorized use of firm resources, violation of the confidentiality clause in your contract, and conduct detrimental to the firm. He picked up the letter. Read it. His face went through several things. He set it back down. The router logs, he said, no, among other things. Ray, you have until end of business to clear your desk. It will escort you out. Your final check will be mailed. He stood up slowly. He looked at me for a long time. I'm sorry, he said. I looked at him. I know you are. That's not enough, is it? No, it's not. He walked out. I heard him in his office for an hour. At 11 o'clock, Marcus from IT walked him to the elevator. I watched through the glass. Gary didn't look back at my office. He just walked to the elevator and got in, and the doors closed. 7 people on my staff went quiet for the rest of the morning. They knew something had happened. They'd figure out what over time. That was fine. I went back to work. That afternoon, I forwarded the Sandra Pell documentation to the Rutherford County School District's compliance office. Not to HR. Sandra was in HR. To the compliance office, which reported to the school board. I included the scheduling discrepancy, the 2 false conference reports, and a statement from the former HR coordinator who'd left in June. I did not include anything about Diane. The complaint was specifically about Sandra's conduct in her official capacity. It stood on its own. The Kathy Morse text chain I filed separately. I sent a copy to Frank Dillard with a note to hold it. If the divorce proceedings got complicated, I wanted Frank to have it. If they didn't, it stayed in the drawer. Frank called me that evening. "The divorce filing is ready when you are," he said. "File it." "You're sure?" "Yes." "All right, I'll have it filed by end of week." I hung up and sat in my office in the quiet of the building after everyone else had left. The Mr. Coffee on the credenza was still on. The last inch of black coffee sitting in the bottom of the pot. The smell of it baked into the air of the room. I'd been smelling that coffee for 11 years. I turned off the Mr. Coffee and went home. Biscuit met me at the door. I fed him. Had a glass of water at the kitchen sink. Looked out the window at the backyard in the October dark. The leaves down now, the yard open and cold looking. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for weeks. I was getting used to it. I got a call from Nora on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the event. "Diane called me," she said. I set down my coffee. What did she say? She wanted to know if I'd talked to you about the divorce filing. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't involve myself in other people's marriages. Good. She cried. I know. Ray, I'm telling you this because I want you to know, not because I think you should do anything differently. I know, Mom. She sounded genuinely scared. She is. Is that what you wanted? I thought about that. No, I said. What I wanted was for it not to happen at all. What I wanted was 14 months ago. Nora was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. I just needed to say it. I know, thank you. Are you eating? Yes, Mom. Good. I drove out to the lake property that afternoon. Walked the dock. The water was cold and flat, the last of the leaves on the maples. I stood there for a while thinking about what Walt had said. A place to land. I called Walt. I've been thinking about building out here, I said. What kind of building? Something small, something I actually want. Not what I thought I was supposed to want. That's a different kind of project than you've been doing. Yeah, I think that's the point. He was quiet for a moment. You'll need a good contractor. I know a man in Smyrna. Of course you do. I heard him smile through the phone. How's the firm? Good. Better, actually. Losing Gary was, it's more work in the short term. But the energy in the office is different. Cleaner. Yeah, cleaner. What about the Nashville connection? The broadcaster. Joanna's referral came through. I'm meeting with them in November. Good. I looked out at the water. Walt. Yeah, thank you. For the documents, for holding them, for all of it. You'd have figured it out. Maybe, but you made it faster. I'm 74 years old, he said. I don't have time for slow. I laughed. I walked back up the dock to the bank and stood there in the cold October air, looking at the 3 acres, the trees, the water. A place to land? Yeah, that was exactly right. The call from Kathy came on a Wednesday night, 5 weeks after the event. 6 weeks after I'd filed for divorce. I was at home eating dinner at the kitchen table with Biscuit at my feet when my phone rang. Kathy's name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. Ray, her voice was tight. I need to talk to you. All right, it's Diane. What about her? Ray, she found out about the lake property. Frank's filing listed it as a separate asset. She called me this afternoon and Kathy stopped. She wants to talk to you. She can call me. She says you won't answer. I answer my phone. Ray, she's really... Kathy lowered her voice. She's scared. She didn't know about the partnership. She didn't know about the lake property. She thought the firm's assets were marital property. Yes, they're not. I know that now. She knows that now. But Ray, she's saying she didn't know what she was walking away from. Those were the words she used. She didn't know what she was walking away from. I set down my fork. Tell her she can call me, I said. She's been calling. She says, you're not picking up. I've been busy, Kathy. Ray, she's begging. I mean that literally. She called me crying for an hour today. She wants to know if there's any way if you'd consider, no. Ray, Kathy, no. Silence on the line. She said to tell you she was wrong, Kathy said quietly. About all of it. About Gary. About what she said in the driveway. I believe her. Then, believing her doesn't change anything. Another silence. What did you build? Kathy asked. She keeps saying that. What did you build? She saw something in the filing and she won't tell me what it is, but it's the firm, I said, and the lake property. In 11 years of work that she thought was small and ordinary, and it turns out wasn't. Kathy was quiet for a long time. She said better men were lining up, Kathy said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes, she did. She said you'd die alone. Yes. And you smiled. Yes. Kathy let out a long breath. God, Ray. Tell her I wish her well, I said. I meant it at the Lakeview Club, and I mean it now. But tell her I'm not coming back from this. Not because I'm angry, because there's nothing to come back to. I hung up. Sat there at the kitchen table, with my dinner getting cold and biscuits head on my foot. The house was quiet. The October dark was outside the windows. She didn't know what she was walking away from. That was true. She'd looked at the firm and seen 8 people in a rented office above a title company. She'd looked at me and seen a man who was too quiet, too steady, too boring to be worth the effort. She'd looked at Gary and seen something shinier and newer and more exciting, and she'd chosen it. And she'd been so sure she was right that she'd said it out loud in the driveway in August. Better men are lining up for me. You'll die alone in this house. I looked around the kitchen, at the table where I'd eaten 1,000 meals, at the Mr. Coffee on the counter, at Biscuit, who was looking up at me with those patient lab eyes. I wasn't alone, not even close. The phone rang again. I looked at the screen. Diane. I let it ring. 4 times. 5. It stopped. A minute later, a text. Ray, please. I set the phone face down on the table, finished my dinner, washed the dish, let Biscuit out into the backyard, stood on the back porch in the cold October air, and looked up at the sky. Clear night, stars out. The kind of night that makes you feel like the world is bigger than whatever problem you're sitting inside. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Diane. Then another from Kathy. Ray, she's really not okay? I put the phone in my pocket. Biscuit came back up the porch steps and sat next to me, leaning his big yellow weight against my leg. I put my hand on his head. You know what the thing is? I said to the dog. He looked up at me. She thought calm meant weak. She thought quiet meant I wasn't paying attention. I scratched his ears. She was wrong about both. Biscuit wagged once, satisfied with the answer. I went inside, locked the back door, and went to bed. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late November, 6 weeks after the filing. Frank Dillard handled it cleanly. Tennessee equitable distribution. The house went to market. The firm's assets were clearly documented as separate property. The lake property was separate. The partnership interest was separate. Diane got her share of the marital assets, which were real and fair. She got the joint savings, her car, her retirement account, and half the equity in the house when it sold. What she didn't get was the firm, or the lake property, or the 11 years of work that she'd called a hobby in the driveway on a hot August afternoon. Frank called me when it was done. Clean, he said, and good. You want to come by and sign the final papers? I'll be there this afternoon. I drove to Nashville in the F-250, windows down in the November cold, the air sharp and clean. I signed the papers in Frank's office on 2nd Avenue, shook his hand, and drove back to Murfreesboro. I stopped at the lake property on the way, parked on the gravel road off Old Nashville Highway, and walked down to the dock. Cold water smell. The maples bare now, the sky white and low, the lake flat and gray and still. I stood there for a while. Then I took out my phone and called Joanna. "It's done," I said. "How do you feel?" "Lighter," I said. "Mostly lighter." "Good. Are you still in Nashville this weekend?" "I am. I'm thinking about driving up Saturday. There's a place on Charlotte Avenue I've been meaning to try." She was quiet for a second, then, "That sounds good, Ray." "Yeah," I said, "it does." I hung up and stood on the dock for another minute. The water was cold and still. A heron came in low over the far end of the lake, the same way it had the last time I was here, and landed without a sound. I watched it for a while. Then, I walked back up the dock to the bank, got in the F-250, and drove home.